Hello, this is a Brighter Futures film short about how research informs policy and changes people's lives. It's my great pleasure to welcome Natasha Lindstaedt from the Department of Government. In this episode, we're talking about international relations and politics, especially authoritarian regimes, failed ones, and failed states. Natasha, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Your expertise is in the politics of states in the broadest sense. Could you tell us a little bit about the research and what you've written about in recent books as well?
Well, most of my research does deal with authoritarian regimes and how they function, how they stay in power, how they fall, what explains their longevity, and also about how they perform. So do they perform better than democracies economically? How do they perform on terms of development indicators, like things like life expectancy, infant mortality, child mortality, how they deal with natural disasters or with diseases. So the bulk of my research is really focused on authoritarian regimes, but more recently I've been looking at democratic backsliding. And another term we have for that is autocratization. And that's one of the big topics for people studying comparative politics, because there are more and more countries that are autocratizing, that are becoming less and less democratic.
Slipping back, if we might put it that way.
Exactly.
Well, tell us a little bit about some of those kind of characteristics of those sorts of countries. I mean, of the countries listed by the UN, something like a third are a authoritarian stroke dictatorships, if we could kind of use that. So we're not talking about a small number, are we?
No, not at all. So if you were to talk about just very close authoritarian regimes, you are talking about a third. But in terms of electoral autocracies too, you would have 70% of the world's population living in non-democratic regimes, or over 5 billion people. And in terms of those that are living in a liberal democracy, it's only 13% of the world's population, some 20 countries or so. So we have a really, really small number of people that are living in these ideal type of liberal democracies, and more countries that are becoming just less democratic. And even authoritarian regimes themselves are becoming more autocratic. And so some of the characteristics that we see in these regimes that are becoming more autocratic is they're highly polarized. So the divisions in society have become worse. People just can't tolerate those that they disagree with. And we're seeing a rise of authoritarian populism take hold, not just in these sort of hybrid regimes or semi-democracies, semi-authoritarian regimes, but in consolidated democracies as well.
And how do we see that kind of playing out in terms of the impacts upon individuals? I mean, you've mentioned some of the sorts of indicators that we might observe, but the evidence for the impact upon people as you get that slipping from one kind of polity to another kind of regime in that sense.
Right. So I think one of the biggest problems with this new type of authoritarianism, and it's considered new because it happens very slowly. We kind of refer to it as creeping authoritarianism. You're not even realizing that you're living in a country that's becoming more authoritarian. And one of these characteristics is that it's very anti-science. It rejects evidence and is all about feeling and how the leader feels in their gut, and also just appealing to the masses and coming up with quick solutions that aren't grounded in any kind of evidence. They sort of shun technocratic expertise. Try to bring in family members, bring in those that are really loyal and just loyal personally to them. And so the regime becomes all about that person. So we're seeing really high levels of personalism, both in dictatorships and democracies. And it's this very specific type of authoritarian populism that has really taken over the world in countries we would have never expected before.
Could you give some examples of those kinds of countries that you would be, that slow creep has kind of led to a particular point where you'd be saying this has become serious now?
Well, I think the big countries that have been noted about this are Brazil, India, a smaller country, Hungary, but it has become authoritarian. It was a democratic country, a member of the EU, and the EU was unable to really do anything about this slide into dictatorship. And then one of the big countries that people have been talking about, of course, is the US. The US faced a violent insurrection, a bloody coup attempt. And there are still 40% of the American population that didn't believe that the election that took place in 2020 was fair. So there's a real shift in terms of the culture as well. And I think that's one of the biggest problems, that the key to any democracy, or the big building block, is a democratic political culture. People need to believe that democracy is the only game in town, and there isn't any other form of government that really is the best to lead and to govern. And now we're seeing people more open to alternative forms of government, and they're doubting the very institutions that uphold democracy. And I think nowhere is this most evident than in the case of the US. And there's real concerns because you have a judiciary that's become completely politicized, and you have Trump, who was ousted from power in election. He doesn't believe it. But in his wake, he appointed 54 federal judges in 4 years that are going to be in power 270 years more than Obama and are loyal to him and his values.
So when thinking about the proposition here, the research, finding out stuff, measuring things, assessing them, then can a priori influence policy. This is actually a really difficult kind of context to imagine that, because you've just said that quite a lot of those changes are deliberately ignoring what evidence and research is showing. So if we started to take the kind of understanding that you've got about this shift and the state of regimes, how do we make things better? I mean, we in the broadest sense. How can you imagine how things then become reversed? Is it through social movements? Is it through the changes in markets? Is it through international change? Perhaps it's bits of all of those things.
That's the million-dollar question that we're trying to figure out and study. How do we reverse this trend? How do we combat authoritarianism? How do we help democracy flourish? So there's been a lot of work done, of course, trying to support political parties, which are a key component of any democracy. And these autocratic-like candidates or would-be autocrats often shun political parties or just use it in order to serve a purpose, but it's not really about building a platform based on an ideology. We talk about support for civil society, as you mentioned, that's really key and critical. And then there are tougher tools that haven't been that effective yet, but we're still trying to study them, like economic sanctions or judicial sanctions. If you isolate regimes so much that they have nothing to lose, we haven't seen that be as effective as we would like. But it really shows the limits that the international community has in addressing this growing authoritarianism. I think one of the directions that things are going to move are going to be about the media and information. We used to have a time when people all received the same information. There's just one or two news channels and facts were facts. Now we have this post-truth era.
Multiply fractured.
Exactly. We have to deal with the fact that authoritarian regimes are actively going into democracies and trying to shape our beliefs by providing false information constantly, using bots to do so, using algorithms, all this kind of stuff. So we have to really address this more urgently.
And can you imagine that happening? I mean, if you looked forward, as you said, kind of 70% of the world's population is living under regimes that don't allow the expression of individual wishes and desires, sometimes don't allow organization for people to come together, don't allow difference to exist almost by definition. And yet human cultures have been usually quite good at those sorts of things in many places. If we're looking forward from here, do you feel kind of optimistic or confident that we can start to reverse some of the recent changes that you've observed?
I'm optimistic in the sense that democracy always goes in waves. And right now we're in a period of democratic decline or democratic slump. But that is then often followed by a reverse wave. And I think it's likely there'll be a pushback. And we saw that 2019 was the year of the protests. There were more democratic protests than we had really seen in a very long time. But this is just a long slog ahead because we're still also seeing cases of authoritarian nostalgia. And we know this by looking at survey research, that people who grew up in authoritarian regimes haven't rejected authoritarianism. You'd think they would because they were oppressed. Instead, we're finding that they're nostalgic about this period because it brought stability and security.
The good old days.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're seeing that not just in post-communist regimes, but also in some of the military regimes in Latin America as well.
So where would you prioritize the sorts of changes? I mean, change requires agency and kind of authority in a sense. The research research you do and colleagues do. We find out stuff. We try to kind of present that in a way. But I'm interested in where that kind of sharp edge of encouraging change, or is it just to keep on going as you've described and let these waves happen? I mean, 2019 was a big year of social action change, and then along comes the pandemic and puts everything on hold for 2 years, effectively. Could we look forward to some kind of hope that that agency will then be expressed in some sort of way that will make big change?
True, but I think part of the research that I've been working on has been focusing on the importance of civic education, and that people need to be educated about what democracy is. We've seen through surveys in particularly newer democracies that the citizens don't really know how democracy functions, and they conflate it with other things. And we're seeing that there's a lack of civic education in consolidated democracies as well, and to promote values of tolerance and discussion and what it means to be a citizen. And I think this is going to be where the biggest push is going to be. We see that working with a country like Myanmar that tried to liberalize and really did a massive reversal, we find that the word democracy wasn't in the lexicon. And so things that we take for granted might not be that well known in other contexts.
So it is then supporting social movements, education, the role of education, as you mentioned. That those are fundamental rights, and perhaps we might point towards, I mean, more than 80% of girls and boys now go to primary school and complete secondary school. That's not 100%, but it's a lot more than 50% as it was, one generation ago, particularly for girls. So that's a trend moving in the right direction, but then you need to get the information, as you've described, into people's hands so they can understand.
Exactly.
These sorts of changes.
Exactly. So education has always been good for democracy, but the type of education does matter. So in authoritarian regimes, they might teach people about how to be subservient to the regime, and that obviously isn't going to be helpful. That socialization process turned out to be very, very damaging. So education has to be about building civic responsibility. But you brought up another point that's actually really important, and that's about gender equality. There's a really clear link between gender equality and democratization. And it was a massive study looking at all the countries historically and a wide range of countries. And that turned out to be really key. Countries that have higher rates of gender equality are much more democratic.
Very interesting, very interesting. So there's an intersection between different sorts of social movements there, the movements that start with being able to vote, leading to social support, leading to sufficient numbers of women in governments, then leadership, but then all the structures of equality within that will shore up democracies in some kind of way and perhaps help others change in that kind of direction.
Yes, and you can't really have a democracy where women are just not equal, where they don't have the same types of rights, where they're not allowed to work, not allowed to vote. That's not a democracy. And you can see this in the countries that are, let's say, the most democratic in Europe. They are also the ones that have the most women involved in high important leadership positions and most involved in the parliaments. So women are really key to this. They're also key to development as well, but it's often an area that is neglected in political science.
And we probably look to Scandinavia as exemplars for this. 5 female leaders of 5 countries at a particular time is, whatever their political hue, that is an important symbol of a different way of leading countries. And opportunities for the future as well.
Right, and we just see that countries that have more women involved in politics just perform better on human rights and on economic and social rights as well, in terms of what they prioritize, what they think is important, and that there's higher levels of consultation. That doesn't mean that men shouldn't be part of it. It just means that there should be roughly equal amounts of men and women involved.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Natasha Lindstaedt, many thanks. You've been watching a Brighter Futures film short. For more on how ideas improve lives, pop along to our sister podcast, Louder Than Words.